You again, Scarface? Didn't burn yourself this week?
Actually, I burned down empires.
For 10 months, they called her Scarface and damaged goods, never suspecting the quiet black waitress was an FBI agent gathering evidence of their money laundering operation. Every Tuesday, Marcus Whitfield and his associates would arrive at the Sterling Cafe in Chicago, discussing $50 million in illegal transactions while mocking the woman serving their coffee for the scars that covered her hands and arms. What they didn't know was that every cruel word, every racist comment, every financial confession was being recorded by federal agent Zara Williams, who had infiltrated their operation with the patience of someone trained to take down criminal empires. Then, an ex-federal agent recognized something that changed everything, a tattoo that revealed her true identity and the criminal investigation that would destroy them all. "Look what crawled out of the hood today," Marcus Whitfield announced as he slammed his briefcase onto the mahogany table at the Sterling Cafe, his voice carrying across the upscale Chicago restaurant like a declaration of war. The sound of expensive leather hitting polished wood made the crystal glasses rattle, but not a single patron looked up from their meals. They had learned, over the months, that Tuesday mornings belonged to Marcus Whitfield and his associates, and smart people minded their own business. All eyes, however, turned to Zara Williams as she approached the table with measured steps, her black uniform pristine despite the early morning rush. The scars that spread across her hands and disappeared under her sleeves caught the morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, creating a map of pain that Whitfield never tired of exploring with his cruelty. "Scarface is back," whispered Bradley Chen, Whitfield's accountant, loud enough for half the restaurant to hear. "I wonder if she burned herself making crack again this week." The laughter that erupted from their table was sharp and cutting, designed to slice through dignity and leave wounds that wouldn't heal. But Zara held the coffee pot with hands that never trembled, her grip steady despite the network of scars that told a story these men could never imagine. What they saw as evidence of street violence or drug accidents were actually the remnants of her last undercover operation, burns sustained while infiltrating a meth lab that had been cooking more than drugs. "Good morning, gentlemen," Zara said, her voice carrying the kind of calm that comes from staring down death and deciding it would have to wait. "The usual Tuesday special?" Whitfield leaned back in his chair, his small eyes gleaming with the particular malice of a man who had never faced real consequences for his cruelty. "The usual, Scarface. But first, tell us, did you get those burns from cooking or from someone teaching you a lesson about staying in your place?" As she poured their coffee with surgical precision, Zara's mind operated like the finely tuned instrument it was, cataloging every word, every name, every detail that would later become evidence in a federal courthouse. The small recording device hidden in her uniform's collar had been activated since 5 a.m., capturing what would become Exhibit A through Z in United States v. Whitfield. "Probably tried to steal from the wrong dealer," added Thomas Morrison, the third member of their weekly money laundering symposium. "You know how it is in those neighborhoods." What none of them realized was that every Tuesday for the past 10 months, they had been confessing their crimes to a federal agent whose patience was matched only by her determination to see justice served. The Sterling Cafe wasn't just Marcus Whitfield's favorite breakfast spot. It was the central hub of a $50 million money laundering operation that had been flying under the radar of local law enforcement, but not federal oversight. "Anything else, Mr. Whitfield?" Zara asked, setting down the last cup with a precision that would have impressed her firearms instructor at Quantico. "Yeah," Whitfield replied, pulling out his phone and opening the camera app. "Smile for my followers, Scarface. I want to show them what happens when people don't know their place in the world." As the camera focused on her scarred hands, Zara allowed herself the smallest of smiles, not from embarrassment or submission, but from the knowledge that Marcus Whitfield was about to document his own confession to federal crimes. Because sometimes, the most dangerous people are exactly the ones who appear to have nothing left to lose. But Zara Williams had everything to gain and 10 months of evidence to prove it. If this story of hidden justice has you hooked, wait until you see what this federal agent is really capable of. Zara Williams had been 29 years old when she walked into the Sterling Cafe for the first time, carrying nothing but a fabricated background and the kind of determination that comes from knowing that justice sometimes requires becoming invisible. The apartment she rented 6 blocks away was sparse, a single bedroom with secondhand furniture and exactly the kind of modest living space that would be expected from someone earning waitress wages. What the landlord didn't know was that the FBI was paying the rent through a series of carefully constructed shell accounts, and that the woman who seemed so grateful for the opportunity to work at an upscale restaurant had graduated summa cum laude from Georgetown Law before joining the Bureau's Financial Crimes Division. The scars on her hands told a story that began 18 months earlier in a warehouse outside Detroit where she had spent 3 weeks infiltrating a drug operation that was laundering money through a network of restaurants. When the operation went sideways and she found herself trapped in a burning building with evidence that could make or break the case, Zara had made the choice that defined her career. She saved the evidence first and worried about her own safety second. The burns had taken months to heal, leaving behind the kind of marks that most people assume tell a story of violence or addiction. But to those who knew how to read them, they told a different story entirely, one of sacrifice, determination, and the kind of courage that comes from believing that some things are worth any price. Every morning at 5 a.m., Zara would arrive at the Sterling Cafe and transform herself into the invisible woman that Marcus Whitfield and his associates needed her to be. She perfected the slight stoop of someone who had been beaten down by life, the downcast eyes of someone who had learned not to expect respect, and the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that survival meant staying beneath notice. But beneath the carefully constructed persona, her mind worked with the precision of the federal agent she remained. Every conversation was memorized, every financial detail cataloged, every name and number stored in the kind of memory that had made her one of the youngest agents ever promoted to lead financial crimes investigations. The Sterling Cafe had been on the FBI's radar for 8 months before Zara's assignment began. Local law enforcement had suspected something was wrong. Too much cash, too many private meetings, too many customers who paid for expensive meals with briefcases full of 20s. But suspicion wasn't evidence, and evidence required someone who could get close enough to document the operation without raising alarm. What made Zara perfect for the assignment wasn't just her ability to disappear into the background, but her expertise in financial crimes. She could recognize money laundering patterns the way a doctor recognizes symptoms, and she understood the complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts that criminals use to hide their profits. The burns on her hands had been a liability in her previous assignment, but for this operation they were perfect camouflage. They gave her a story that explained why someone with her obvious intelligence might be working as a waitress, and they provided the kind of visible damage that men like Marcus Whitfield couldn't resist exploiting. As she tied her apron each morning and prepared to endure another day of calculated humiliation, Zara reminded herself that every insult was evidence. Every cruel joke was another nail in the coffin she was building around Whitfield's criminal empire. The patience required for long-term undercover work wasn't natural. It was trained, developed through months of psychological preparation, and the absolute certainty that justice, when it finally came, would be worth the wait. What Marcus Whitfield saw as a broken woman was actually a federal weapon, calibrated for precision and loaded with 10 months of evidence that would destroy everything he had built. But you haven't seen anything yet compared to what happens when a federal agent's cover is about to be blown. You know what I love about this place? Marcus Whitfield said, gesturing around the Sterling Cafe with the proprietary air of someone who believed money could buy anything, including the right to humiliate other human beings. It employs exactly the kind of people who understand their position in the world. Bradley Chen nodded enthusiastically, his phone already out and recording as Zara approached their table with the precision of someone who had learned to navigate hostile territory. People who know when to keep their mouths shut, he added, focusing the camera on her scarred hands as she set down their plates. Speaking of keeping quiet, Thomas Morrison said, lowering his voice just enough to create the illusion of discretion while speaking loud enough for Zara to hear every word. The Miami operation cleared another $2 million last week. Clean as a whistle through the restaurant chain. Zara's training kicked in automatically. The slight tilt of her head that suggested she wasn't really listening. The focus on her tasks that implied she was too simple to understand the significance of what was being discussed. But every word was being recorded, every detail cataloged in both digital and human memory. 2 million? Whitfield's eyebrows rose in what appeared to be surprise, but was actually theatrical performance for the benefit of anyone who might be watching. That's excellent news. The offshore accounts are ready for the transfer? As she refilled their water glasses, Zara noted the casual way they discussed moving millions of dollars through illegal channels, the complete confidence that comes from believing you're invisible to law enforcement. The Sterling Cafe had become their private office, a place where they could conduct business in plain sight because they had convinced themselves that the help was beneath notice. The beauty of our system, Morrison continued, cutting into his eggs Benedict with the satisfaction of a man discussing a successful hobby, is that every transaction looks completely legitimate. Restaurant revenues, consulting fees, catering contracts. The IRS sees exactly what we want them to see. Bradley pulled up spreadsheets on his tablet, the screen visible to Zara as she cleaned the table next to theirs. Financial records that would have taken federal investigators months to uncover were being displayed openly, discussed with the kind of detail that would make a prosecutor weep with joy. "Scarface here probably can't even read," Whitfield said, nodding toward Zara with contemptuous amusement. "Perfect employee for our kind of business. The kind who sees everything and understands nothing." The irony was so perfect that Zara had to fight to keep her expression neutral. Marcus Whitfield was describing, with uncanny accuracy, exactly what he believed her to be, and exactly what made her so dangerous to him. An invisible witness with perfect recall and federal authority. "Speaking of understanding nothing," Chen said, zooming in on Zara's scars with his phone camera, "I still think those burns are from cooking meth. Look at the pattern. Definitely chemical burns from amateur drug manufacturing. What they were actually looking at were burns sustained while Zara maintained her cover in a burning building long enough to secure evidence that led to the conviction of 14 people for operating a multi-state drug distribution network. But their ignorance was her advantage. Their cruelty was her camouflage, and their confidence was becoming their downfall. "The next transfer is scheduled for Thursday," Morrison said, consulting his notes with the casual efficiency of someone discussing grocery shopping. 50,000 through the Chicago location, 200 through Detroit, and the big one. 1.5 million through the Miami hub. As Zara walked away from their table, she carried with her the kind of evidence that federal prosecutors dream about. Detailed financial information, specific dates and amounts, and all of it freely given by criminals who believed they were untouchable. What these criminals didn't know was that every word was building a federal case that would destroy everything they had built. "Hold on," Marcus Whitfield said, his voice carrying the dangerous edge that comes from a man who has run out of patience for subtlety. "I want everyone to see this." He stood up from his chair, phone held high, and addressed the restaurant with the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to meet our server, a perfect example of what happens when people make poor life choices." The Sterling Cafe fell silent, except for the soft jazz playing through hidden speakers and the distant sound of traffic on Lakeshore Drive. Other patrons looked up from their meals, some with obvious discomfort, others with the kind of morbid curiosity that comes from watching someone else's humiliation from a safe distance. Zara continued clearing the adjacent table, her movement steady and professional despite every instinct screaming at her to break character and show Marcus Whitfield exactly what a federal agent was capable of when pushed too far. But 10 months of evidence hung in the balance, and she had learned long ago that the best revenge was the kind that destroyed your enemy completely. "Look at those scars," Whitfield continued, pointing his camera directly at her hands. "Street violence, probably. Or maybe she was cooking something she shouldn't have been cooking and learned a hard lesson about chemistry." "Burnt money can't buy you class," Bradley Chen added, encouraged by the attention and the nervous laughter from nearby tables. But it can apparently buy you a job serving people who actually matter. But that was when Marcus Whitfield crossed the line that would ultimately destroy him. "You know what I think?" he said, stepping closer to Zara with the predatory confidence of someone who believed himself untouchable. "I think damaged goods like this should come with warning labels. Caution, maybe carrying diseases from the hood." The racist implications were clear enough that several patrons began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, some reaching for phones to record what was becoming an increasingly disturbing public display. But Zara simply looked up from the table she was cleaning and met Marcus Whitfield's eyes directly for the first time in 10 months. "Keep recording, Mr. Whitfield," she said, her voice carrying the same calm professionalism she had maintained throughout their entire acquaintance. "I'm sure you'll want this for posterity." Something in her tone made Whitfield hesitate for just a moment, a flash of uncertainty that crossed his face like a cloud passing over the sun. But his arrogance was stronger than his instincts, and he continued filming with renewed enthusiasm. "See how she tries to act superior?" he said to his audience, both in the restaurant and on his phone. "This is exactly why people like this need to be reminded of their place in the world." It was at that moment that Marcus Kane walked through the front door of the Sterling Cafe, drawn by reports he had received from concerned citizens about disturbing incidents involving public harassment. Kane had spent 15 years with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division before retiring to private consulting, and he possessed the kind of trained awareness that comes from decades of identifying threats and anomalies. What caught his attention first wasn't the obvious cruelty of the scene unfolding at the center table, but something subtle in the posture and bearing of the woman being targeted. There was something about the way she moved, the way she maintained perfect situational awareness while appearing to focus entirely on her work, that triggered recognition bells in his well-trained mind. As Zara leaned down to pick up a fallen napkin, the sleeve of her uniform rode up just enough to reveal the edge of something that made Marcus Kane's heart rate spike, the partial outline of a federal eagle tattoo, the kind that FBI agents sometimes got to commemorate particularly dangerous assignments. What happened next would prove that some people picked the wrong target at exactly the wrong time. Marcus Kane had developed his instincts over 15 years of federal service, and those instincts were currently screaming at him that something was very wrong with the scene unfolding at the center table. The woman being humiliated wasn't reacting the way civilians typically reacted to public harassment. There was no tears, no visible emotional distress, no attempt to escape or deflect the attention. Instead, she moved with the kind of controlled precision that Kane recognized from his own training. Every step was measured, every gesture economical, and her awareness of the room's dynamics was the kind that came from professional security training, not waitressing experience. Around the restaurant, other patrons were reacting with varying degrees of discomfort and moral outrage. An elderly couple in the corner booth had stopped eating entirely, the woman whispering urgently to her husband about whether they should intervene. A business executive at the bar was discreetly recording the incident on his phone, his expression suggesting he was documenting evidence rather than entertainment. "This is getting out of hand," murmured the restaurant manager, Tony Rizzo, to one of his servers near the kitchen door. But his concern was clearly more about the disruption to his establishment than the welfare of his employee. The Sterling Cafe depended on high-end clientele, and Marcus Whitfield's weekly parties brought in significant revenue that Tony was reluctant to jeopardize. At the center of it all, Marcus Whitfield continued his performance with the enthusiasm of someone who believed he was both righteous and untouchable. "You see, this is exactly the problem with hiring people from certain neighborhoods," he announced to his growing audience. "They bring their problems with them." Bradley Chen had his tablet out again, showing financial spreadsheets to anyone who would look. "We help businesses clean up their employee problems," he said, apparently unaware that he was confessing to systematic discrimination while being recorded by multiple devices. "Companies pay us good money to identify and eliminate troublesome workers." What Kane found most interesting was how the target of their harassment continued to work with mechanical efficiency, showing no signs of the stress response that would be normal in such a situation. She was either heavily medicated, completely broken, or professionally trained to handle hostile situations. Given her physical bearing and the glimpse he had caught of what looked like federal tattoo work, Kane was beginning to suspect the third option. Thomas Morrison, emboldened by the attention and the apparent immunity his wealth provided, decided to escalate the situation further. "Hey, Scarface," he called out, loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. "Tell everyone how you got those burns. Were you cooking drugs or stealing from drug dealers?" The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and Kane watched carefully for the woman's response. What he saw confirmed his growing suspicions. She paused for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to consider multiple response options, then continued with her tasks without any visible emotional reaction. That kind of emotional control under severe public harassment wasn't natural, it was trained. "You know what I love about places like this?" Whitfield continued, gesturing broadly with his phone still recording. "They employ exactly the kind of people who need to be reminded that actions have consequences. Street violence, drug dealing, prostitution, it all catches up eventually." Kane made his decision. Moving with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to inserting himself into potentially dangerous situations, he approached the service station where the woman was preparing to refill coffee pots. "Excuse me," he said quietly, positioning himself so that his conversation wouldn't be overheard by Whitfield's table. "I couldn't help but notice your bearing under pressure. Military background?" The woman looked up at him with eyes that seemed to assess him completely in about 2 seconds, another professional behavior that confirmed Kane's suspicions. What she said next would change everything these criminals thought they knew about their perfect victim. "Financial Crimes Division," Marcus Kane said quietly, showing Zara his retired FBI credentials with the subtle movement of someone accustomed to discreet identification. 15 years in the Bureau. I recognize the signs." Zara's assessment was instant and thorough. Kane's posture, the way he positioned himself for optimal situational awareness, the casual but deliberate way he had approached her during the distraction at Whitfield's table. Everything about him screamed federal law enforcement, and her training kicked in with automatic precision. "Marcus Kane," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper as she continued to prepare coffee service. "I know the name. Miami Money Laundering Task Force, 2018, 20 to 20. Solid work." The confirmation hit Kane like a bolt of lightning. Not only was she federal, but she knew his case history well enough to cite specific assignments. That level of familiarity suggested she wasn't just Bureau, she was Financial Crimes Division, and probably someone who had studied his work. "Agent Zara Williams," she continued, her movements never pausing as she balanced her cover with the need to establish trust with a potential ally. 10 months deep on Operation Sterling Silver. These idiots have been confessing to federal crimes every Tuesday for almost a year. Kane felt his pulse spike as the full implications hit him. He wasn't witnessing workplace harassment. He was watching the final stages of a major federal investigation, and Marcus Whitfield was being allowed to hang himself with his own rope. "The restaurant is a front?" Kane asked, though his experience told him he already knew the answer. $50 million over 2 years, Zara confirmed, refilling sugar dispensers with the kind of mundane efficiency that provided perfect cover for a federal briefing. Money laundering through a network of upscale restaurants. Whitfield runs the operation, Chen handles the books, Morrison manages the offshore accounts. Meanwhile, at the center table, the 3 criminals continued their performance, completely unaware that they were providing a real-time confession to 2 federal agents. Whitfield had moved on from personal attacks to discussing business operations with the kind of detail that would make a prosecutor's career. "The beauty of our system," Whitfield was saying to his phone camera and the restaurant full of witnesses, "is that we can clean any amount of money through legitimate business operations. Restaurants are perfect, lots of cash transactions, reasonable profit margins, and employees who don't ask questions." Kane watched in amazement as Morrison pulled out actual financial documents and began explaining money laundering techniques to their growing audience of potential witnesses. "See, you take dirty money from drug operations, gambling, whatever," Morrison said, pointing to spreadsheets on his tablet. Then you run it through restaurant sales, catering contracts, consulting fees. The IRS sees legitimate business income. They've been doing this every Tuesday for 10 months, Zara said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had endured enormous personal cost to gather evidence. Complete financial records, detailed operational discussions, client names, offshore account numbers. They think I'm too stupid to understand what they're talking about. And the scars? Kane asked, having noticed the professional quality of the burn patterns on her hands. Last assignment. Had to maintain cover in a burning meth lab long enough to secure evidence. 3 weeks in the hospital, 6 months of physical therapy, and a commendation for dedication to duty that I've never been able to display publicly. Kane felt a surge of professional respect mixed with outrage. Zara Williams had sacrificed her physical well-being for federal law enforcement, only to be mocked for those same sacrifices by the very criminals she was working to expose. But what these criminals didn't know was that 10 months of patience was about to pay off in ways they could never imagine. Marcus Whitfield's confidence had reached dangerous levels, fueled by what he perceived as complete immunity and an audience that seemed incapable of challenging his authority. He had put his phone away and was now addressing the restaurant like a lecturer speaking to students, apparently convinced that his wealth and status made him untouchable. "You see, the problem with people like our server here," he said, gesturing toward Zara with the casual dismissiveness of someone discussing livestock, "is that they don't understand the natural order of things. Some people are meant to lead, and others are meant to serve." Bradley Chen had apparently decided that this was an excellent opportunity to discuss their business operations in detail. "Take our consulting firm, for example," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We help successful businesses identify and eliminate problem employees, especially those who don't fit the company culture." "Company culture," Thomas Morrison repeated with obvious amusement. "That's a good way to put it. Can't have people working in high-end establishments who might make customers uncomfortable." Kane listened with growing amazement as the three men systematically confessed to systematic discrimination, money laundering, and what sounded like organized criminal activity. But what impressed him most was Zara's complete emotional control. She continued working with machine-like efficiency, showing no reaction to increasingly personal and racist attacks. "I bet those scars are from gang initiation," Whitfield continued, warming to his theme. "Or maybe her boyfriend taught her a lesson about talking back. You know how domestic violence works in those communities." The restaurant had grown increasingly uncomfortable, with several patrons finishing their meals quickly and leaving tips on their tables before departing. But others seemed mesmerized by the spectacle, unable to look away from what was becoming an increasingly surreal display of criminal arrogance. "The most important thing," Chen said, consulting his tablet with the efficiency of someone discussing quarterly reports, "is maintaining plausible deniability. Everything we do looks completely legitimate on paper. The beauty of our system is that even if someone was recording us, they'd need financial expertise to understand what they were hearing." Kane almost laughed at the irony. Chen was absolutely correct. Understanding the financial crimes being discussed required significant expertise in money laundering operations. Unfortunately for them, they were confessing to someone with exactly that expertise. "Recording us," Morrison repeated with obvious amusement. "Like Scarface here could understand complex financial operations even if she was paying attention. Which she's not, because people like her learn early to mind their own business." What Morrison couldn't see was that Zara was paying such close attention that she could probably recite their conversation verbatim in federal court. Every name, every amount, every operational detail was being cataloged with the precision of someone who had spent 10 months building an airtight case. "You know what I love most about our weekly meetings here?" Whitfield said, raising his coffee cup in a mock toast. "Complete privacy. We could discuss anything we wanted, and nobody here has the intelligence or the connections to do anything about it." Kane exchanged a look with Zara that carried volumes of professional communication. Whitfield had just provided what prosecutors call consciousness of guilt, an acknowledgement that what they were discussing was illegal, combined with confidence that they were safe from law enforcement oversight. "Sometimes," Zara said quietly, her voice carrying just enough volume for Whitfield to hear. People are exactly wrong about everything they think they know. The comment was subtle enough to maintain her cover, but clear enough to plant a seed of doubt in anyone intelligent enough to catch the implication. What these criminals were about to discover was that federal agents have very long memories and very detailed records. Marcus Kane had made his decision. After 15 years of federal service, he recognized a situation that was about to reach critical mass, and he wasn't going to watch a fellow agent endure further abuse when he had the power to intervene. "Agent Williams," he said quietly, moving closer to the service station where she was organizing supplies. "How much more evidence do you need?" "The operation concludes Thursday," Zara replied, her voice barely audible as she maintained perfect cover. "Final financial transfers that will complete the RICO predicate acts. But honestly, we could move tomorrow if necessary." Kane nodded, understanding the delicate balance between gathering maximum evidence and protecting an undercover agent's safety and sanity. 10 months was a long time to maintain deep cover, especially under the kind of psychological pressure that Zara had been enduring. At the center table, Marcus Whitfield seemed to be reaching some kind of crescendo in his performance. He had attracted the attention of most of the restaurant's remaining patrons, and his confidence had reached levels that Kane recognized as dangerous to operational security. "The thing about people like our server," Whitfield was saying, his voice carrying the authoritative tone of someone delivering a lecture, "is that they're fundamentally incapable of understanding complex operations. It's not their fault. It's just genetics and environment." The racist implications were now so blatant that even the most uncomfortable patrons couldn't pretend to ignore them. An elderly businessman at a corner table was discreetly speaking into his phone, apparently reporting the incident to someone in authority. "Take money laundering, for example," Bradley Chen said, apparently oblivious to how his words would sound to anyone with law enforcement experience. "It requires sophisticated understanding of financial systems, international banking, corporate structure, not the kind of thing you learn on the streets." Kane watched Zara's face for any sign of reaction to Chen's breathtaking ignorance about her qualifications. She held a master's degree in forensic accounting from Northwestern and had spent 5 years specializing in exactly the kind of international financial crimes that Chen was describing. But her expression remained neutral, giving away nothing. "The key to our success," Thomas Morrison added, consulting what appeared to be operational notes on his phone, "is that we operate in plain sight. Regular meeting locations, consistent schedules, normal business discussions. Even if law enforcement was watching, they'd see exactly what we want them to see." What Morrison couldn't know was that law enforcement had been watching for 10 months, recording every word, and building a case that would likely result in life sentences for all 3 men. "Agent Williams," Kane said quietly, "I have contacts at the Chicago field office. One phone call could have backup here in 15 minutes. "Appreciate the offer," Zara replied, checking her watch with practiced subtlety. "But the timing has to be perfect. Thursday's transfers complete the pattern we need for federal prosecution. Moving too early could compromise 18 months of investigation." Kane understood. Federal cases, especially RICO prosecutions, required meticulous evidence gathering and perfect timing. Zara had invested too much to risk the case on premature action, no matter how personally satisfying it might be to end Whitfield's performance immediately. "Besides," Zara added, allowing herself the smallest smile, "Mr. Whitfield is about to provide us with the best evidence we could possibly hope for." As if summoned by her words, Whitfield stood up from his table and addressed the entire restaurant. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to make something perfectly clear. Success in America requires understanding your place in the natural order. Some people are born to lead, others to serve, and trying to change that natural order leads to the kind of problems our server here obviously experienced." What Marcus Whitfield didn't realize was that he was about to learn exactly what happens when you mock someone who has federal authority and 10 months of evidence. The moment came when Zara bent down to retrieve a dropped menu from beneath a nearby table. As she reached forward, the sleeve of her black uniform shifted just enough to reveal what Marcus Kane had suspected but hadn't been able to confirm: a federal eagle tattoo on her forearm, the kind that FBI agents sometimes got to commemorate particularly dangerous assignments. But more importantly, Marcus Whitfield saw it too. For the first time in 10 months, Whitfield's confident expression faltered. He had spent enough time around law enforcement during various misunderstandings to recognize federal tattoo work when he saw it. The federal eagle was distinctive, and it definitely wasn't the kind of body art that someone acquired in a casual tattoo parlor. "Wait a minute," Whitfield said, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that his associates immediately noticed. "Scarface? What's that on your arm?" Zara straightened slowly, making no attempt to hide the tattoo now that it had been observed. The time for complete concealment was over, but the time for full revelation hadn't quite arrived. She was walking the razor's edge of operational security, balancing the need to maintain her cover with the reality that her identity was beginning to surface. "Just a tattoo, Mr. Whitfield," she replied, her voice maintaining the same professional calm she had displayed for 10 months. But there was something different in her posture now, a subtle shift that Kane recognized as an agent preparing for potential combat situations. Bradley Chen leaned forward, squinting at the partially visible tattoo. His expression suggested that he, too, was beginning to recognize something that didn't fit with their assumptions about their regular target. "That's not a regular tattoo," he said slowly. "That looks like—" "Federal," Kane said quietly, stepping forward with the confidence of someone who no longer needed to hide his own identity. "FBI Financial Crimes Division, if I'm not mistaken." The words hit the table like a bomb detonation. Morrison's tablet slipped from his hands and clattered to the floor. Chen's face went white as he apparently began to calculate exactly how much evidence they had provided over the past 10 months. And Whitfield looked like someone who had just realized he had been playing Russian roulette with a fully loaded gun. "Federal agent?" Whitfield repeated, his voice climbing an octave. "That's impossible. She's just a federal agent conducting a 10-month undercover investigation into your money laundering operation," Zara said, her voice now carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who no longer needed to pretend to be powerless. "Agent Zara Williams, FBI Financial Crimes Division." The transformation was instantaneous and complete. The woman who had endured 10 months of racist harassment and personal attacks was revealed to be exactly what Marcus Whitfield should have feared most: a federal law enforcement officer with the patience, expertise, and authority to destroy everything he had built. "This is impossible," Chen whispered, apparently trying to convince himself that reality could be negotiated. "You're just a waitress. You serve coffee." "I serve justice," Zara replied, reaching into her apron and producing a small recording device that had been documenting their conversations for months. "And I've been serving you a federal indictment one confession at a time." Kane stepped forward, displaying his retired FBI credentials. "Agent Marcus Kane, Financial Crimes Division retired. And I can confirm that Agent Williams has just concluded one of the most successful long-term undercover operations in Bureau history." The restaurant had gone completely silent except for the sound of Morrison frantically trying to delete files from his tablet and Chen hyperventilating into a cloth napkin. What happened next proved that federal justice doesn't negotiate with criminals who think they're untouchable. The silence that followed Zara's revelation stretched for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 15 seconds. In that moment, Marcus Whitfield's entire understanding of the past 10 months underwent a complete and devastating reconstruction. Every cruel joke, every racist comment, every detailed discussion of money laundering operations suddenly took on the weight of federal evidence. 10 months, he whispered, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, rage, and growing terror. "You've been recording us for 10 months. "Every Tuesday," Zara confirmed, her voice now carrying the calm authority of someone who no longer needed to hide behind a service industry facade. "Every confession, every financial detail, every discriminatory comment. $50 million in money laundering operations, documented with the kind of precision that federal prosecutors dream about." Bradley Chen was frantically scrolling through his tablet, apparently trying to calculate how much incriminating evidence they had voluntarily provided to a federal agent. His hands were shaking so badly that he could barely operate the touchscreen. "The spreadsheets," he said, his voice barely audible. "All those financial records we showed you. The offshore account numbers, the client lists. Photographed and transmitted to the Chicago field office in real time," Kane confirmed, taking obvious professional satisfaction in watching criminals realize the scope of their exposure. "Agent Williams has been providing the Bureau with the most detailed financial crime evidence in departmental history." Thomas Morrison had gone completely white and was making small choking sounds as he apparently began to understand the federal sentencing guidelines for RICO violations combined with money laundering. "This can't be legal," he managed to say. "Entrapment, illegal surveillance, something." "Actually," Zara said, reaching into her uniform and producing a small badge that had been hidden beneath her collar, "it's called excellent police work. And every conversation you've had in this restaurant has been legally recorded with single-party consent." The badge hit the table with a metallic clink that sounded like a gavel striking wood. The gold and blue FBI credentials were unmistakable, and they transformed everything that had happened over the past 10 months, from harassment of a powerless service worker into criminal confession to a federal law enforcement officer. "You have to understand," Whitfield said, his voice taking on the desperate tone of someone trying to negotiate with gravity. "We never actually did anything illegal. We were just talking, hypothetically." Kane laughed with the kind of professional amusement that comes from decades of hearing similar rationalizations. "Mr. Whitfield, you just spent 10 months providing detailed operational briefings to an FBI agent. You discussed specific amounts, specific dates, specific offshore accounts, and specific methods for avoiding federal detection. The Miami transfers alone constitute enough evidence for a RICO prosecution," Zara added, consulting notes that she no longer needed to hide. $2 million moved through restaurant operations last week, with complete documentation of the laundering methods used. The transformation in the restaurant's atmosphere was palpable. Other patrons were now openly staring, some recording the conversation on their phones, others calling what appeared to be news organizations or law enforcement contacts. The Sterling Cafe had become the scene of a major federal arrest operation, and everyone present understood they were witnessing something historic. "This is why you never reacted," Morrison said, his voice carrying the tone of someone solving a puzzle that was destroying his life. 10 months of harassment, and you never broke character because you're a federal agent. Agent Williams maintained perfect operational security while enduring systematic racist harassment and personal attacks," Kane said, his voice carrying obvious admiration mixed with professional outrage. "That kind of dedication to duty is what separates federal agents from ordinary citizens." Zara allowed herself a small smile, the first genuine expression of satisfaction she had displayed in 10 months. But what these criminals were about to discover was that federal agents don't just gather evidence. They also ensure that justice is applied with the full force of federal law. Marcus Whitfield made the mistake that criminals always make when they realize the game is over. He tried to negotiate with federal authority as if it were a business transaction that could be influenced by money or connections. "Look, Agent Williams," he said, his voice taking on the false sincerity of someone who had spent years manipulating people with wealth and perceived status. "I think there's been a misunderstanding here. We're legitimate businessmen. Maybe our conversations sounded worse than they actually were." Zara looked at him with the kind of calm assessment that federal agents use when evaluating threats to national security. "Mr. Whitfield, in the past 10 months, you have confessed to money laundering, systematic discrimination, tax evasion, and operating a criminal enterprise. You've provided detailed operational information, financial records, and client lists. There's no misunderstanding." The other patrons in the restaurant were now openly watching the confrontation, with several people recording video on their phones. The Sterling Cafe had become an impromptu federal crime scene, and everyone present understood they were witnessing the conclusion of a major law enforcement operation. "You have to understand our position," Bradley Chen interrupted, his voice shaking with what appeared to be genuine terror. "We have families, businesses, employees who depend on us. Kane stepped forward with the authority of someone who had spent 15 years dealing with similar rationalizations. Mr. Chen, federal agents also have families, and Agent Williams spent 10 months away from hers, enduring systematic harassment and racist attacks to build the case that's going to put you in federal prison. The moral weight of that statement hung in the air like a physical presence. Zara had sacrificed her personal safety, her psychological well-being, and her professional anonymity to gather evidence against criminals who had treated her like a subhuman target for their cruelty. "The burns on Agent Williams' hands," Kane continued, his voice carrying the kind of cold anger that comes from professional respect, "are from her previous undercover assignment, where she maintained cover in a burning building to secure evidence against drug dealers. You've been mocking a federal agent for injuries sustained in the line of duty." Thomas Morrison was now hyperventilating into a cloth napkin, apparently beginning to understand the full scope of federal sentencing guidelines for the crimes they had confessed to committing. "We can make this right," he managed to say between gasps. "Financial compensation, restitution, whatever it takes." "What it takes," Zara said, her voice carrying the finality of someone delivering a verdict, "is federal prosecution under RICO statutes, money laundering laws, and civil rights violations. You can't negotiate with federal justice, Mr. Morrison." Whitfield made one final, desperate attempt to reassert the authority he had wielded for 10 months. "You think you're so smart," he said, his voice rising with panic-driven anger. "But you're still just a federal agent with 10 months of evidence, a master's degree in forensic accounting, and the full backing of the United States Department of Justice," Zara interrupted, her voice cutting through his attempted insult with surgical precision. The complete reversal of power dynamics was stunning in its totality. The woman who had been called Scarface and damaged goods was revealed to be exactly the kind of federal authority that white-collar criminals feared most: intelligent, patient, and absolutely relentless in the pursuit of justice. "Agent Williams," Kane said, checking his watch with professional efficiency, "I believe it's time to conclude this operation." "Agreed," Zara replied, reaching for the phone that she had kept hidden for 10 months. "Chicago Field Office, this is Agent Williams. Operation Sterling Silver is complete. Request immediate backup for arrest procedures." What Marcus Whitfield was about to learn was that when you confess federal crimes to a federal agent for 10 months, the consequences are exactly as devastating as you should have expected. The phone call that Zara placed to the Chicago FBI field office transformed the Sterling Cafe from an upscale restaurant into the epicenter of a federal law enforcement operation. Within minutes, the sound of approaching sirens could be heard through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and unmarked sedans began pulling up outside the building. "Federal agents, FBI!" The voice that echoed through the restaurant belonged to Special Agent Maria Santos, Zara's handler and the supervisor who had coordinated Operation Sterling Silver for the past 10 months. She entered with a team of 6 agents, all wearing tactical gear and carrying the kind of documentation that turns restaurants into crime scenes. Marcus Whitfield made one last desperate attempt to control the narrative. "This is harassment," he announced to the restaurant full of witnesses, apparently hoping that public pressure could somehow influence federal law enforcement procedures. "We're legitimate businessmen being entrapped by illegal surveillance." Agent Santos approached Whitfield with the calm efficiency of someone who had spent years arresting white-collar criminals. "Mr. Marcus Whitfield, you're under arrest for violations of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, money laundering, tax evasion, and civil rights violations." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Whitfield's expression went through the final stages of criminal denial: disbelief, rage, and finally a kind of broken acceptance that his life as he knew it was over. "Agent Williams," Santos said, turning to Zara with obvious professional respect. "Outstanding work. 10 months of evidence that's going to make prosecutors weep with joy." The transformation of Zara from invisible waitress to celebrated federal agent was complete and total. She stood straighter, spoke with unmistakable authority, and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had successfully completed one of the most challenging undercover assignments in bureau history. "The financial evidence is particularly comprehensive," Zara reported, consulting notes that she no longer needed to hide. $50 million in documented money laundering transactions complete with operational details, offshore account information, and client lists. Bradley Chen was being read his rights by Agent Rodriguez, but he kept staring at Zara as if he still couldn't process the complete reversal of everything he thought he knew about their Tuesday morning entertainment. "You actually understood everything," he said, his voice carrying the tone of someone whose entire worldview had just collapsed. "All those financial discussions, the offshore accounts, the laundering methods." "Master's degree in forensic accounting from Northwestern," Zara replied matter-of-factly. 5 years specializing in international financial crimes. "I understood your operation better than you did." Thomas Morrison was being escorted toward the door in handcuffs, but he turned back to address the restaurant full of witnesses. "She lied to us," he said, apparently still trying to generate sympathy for his situation. "She pretended to be something she wasn't. She pretended to be powerless so she could gather evidence of your crimes," Kane replied, his voice carrying obvious admiration for Zara's professionalism. "That's called excellent police work." The Sterling Cafe had become a federal evidence collection site, with agents photographing documents, seizing electronic devices, and interviewing witnesses. What had been Marcus Whitfield's private criminal headquarters was now the scene of his complete downfall. "Agent Williams," Agent Santos said. "The U.S. Attorney's Office is calling this one of the most comprehensive RICO cases they've ever prosecuted. Your evidence is going to destroy this entire criminal network." As the 3 handcuffed men were led toward federal transportation, Whitfield made one final attempt to address Zara directly. "You think you've won," he said, his voice carrying the impotent rage of someone whose authority had been completely stripped away. "Mr. Whitfield," Zara replied, her voice carrying the calm satisfaction of someone whose patience had been vindicated by perfect justice, "I haven't won anything. The federal justice system has simply functioned exactly as it was designed to function." What happened next proved that federal law enforcement doesn't just arrest criminals, it dismantles their entire criminal enterprise and ensures that justice is both swift and permanent. The arrest of Marcus Whitfield, Bradley Chen, and Thomas Morrison at the Sterling Cafe created immediate ripple effects that extended far beyond the walls of the upscale Chicago restaurant. Within hours, federal agents were executing search warrants at 12 locations across 3 states, seizing assets worth over $75 million, and arresting 17 additional individuals connected to the money laundering network. "This is the largest financial crimes takedown in Chicago FBI history," Agent Santos announced to the assembled media outside the restaurant. Agent Williams's 10-month undercover operation has provided evidence for RICO prosecutions that will likely result in life sentences for the primary defendants. Inside the restaurant, Zara was finally able to remove the small recording devices that she had worn every day for 10 months. The technology was sophisticated enough to capture conversations from across the dining room, but small enough to remain completely hidden beneath her waitress uniform. "Every Tuesday for 43 weeks. She explained to the gathering crowd of federal agents, local law enforcement, and media representatives. 437 hours of recorded conversations, including detailed confessions to money laundering, tax evasion, and systematic discrimination. The transformation of Zara from ignored service worker to celebrated federal agent was being documented by news cameras. But what struck observers most was her complete professionalism throughout the process. There was no celebration, no visible satisfaction, just the calm efficiency of someone who had successfully completed an extraordinarily difficult assignment. Marcus Kane, now identified as a retired FBI agent who had provided crucial assistance during the final phase of the operation, was being interviewed by federal supervisors about his role in confirming Zara's identity and facilitating the arrest procedures. "Agent Williams maintained perfect operational security for 10 months, Kane told Agent Santos. "I've never seen anything like it. The psychological pressure she endured while gathering evidence was extraordinary." The Sterling Cafe itself was being transformed into a federal evidence collection site. Financial documents that Whitfield and his associates had displayed openly were being photographed and cataloged. Electronic devices were being seized for forensic analysis. Even the table where they had conducted their weekly money laundering symposiums was being treated as evidence. The irony, Agent Santos observed, is that they provided more detailed evidence than we could have obtained with years of traditional investigation. They documented their own crimes with the kind of precision that prosecutors dream about. Tony Rizzo, the restaurant manager, was being interviewed by federal agents about his knowledge of the criminal activities that had been conducted in his establishment. His obvious terror suggested that his involvement had been limited to willful ignorance rather than active participation, but federal investigators were taking no chances. "I just thought they were regular customers," Rizzo kept repeating. "Rich guys who tipped well and minded their own business." The other restaurant patrons who had witnessed 10 months of harassment were now being interviewed as potential witnesses in what was certain to become a major federal trial. Several expressed regret about not intervening earlier, not understanding that their failure to act had actually protected the integrity of a crucial federal investigation. "If we had known she was a federal agent," said Margaret Chen, an elderly patron who had witnessed several harassment incidents, "we would have done something. But she seemed so professional about handling it herself." The financial evidence alone was staggering. Bank records showed transfers of over $50 million through restaurant operations, with detailed documentation of the laundering methods used to hide the criminal origins of the money. "This case is going to change how we investigate organized financial crime," Agent Santos explained to reporters. "Agent Williams has demonstrated that long-term undercover operations can provide evidence that would be impossible to obtain through traditional methods. But the arrests were just the beginning. What came next would prove that federal justice extends far beyond individual criminals to the systems that enable their crimes." 6 months after the arrests at the Sterling Cafe, the federal courthouse in Chicago became the center of what legal experts were calling the most comprehensive RICO prosecution in the district's history. Marcus Whitfield, Bradley Chen, and Thomas Morrison faced charges that carried potential life sentences, and the evidence provided by Agent Zara Williams' 10-month investigation was so overwhelming that plea negotiations had been abandoned. The defendant's own recorded confessions provide the foundation for charges under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, announced U.S. Attorney Patricia Reeves during a press conference that attracted national media attention. "We have documented evidence of a criminal enterprise that laundered over $50 million while systematically discriminating against employees and victims. The trial itself became a showcase for federal law enforcement excellence. Agent Williams testified for 3 days, providing detailed explanations of the financial crimes she had documented while maintaining her undercover identity. Her testimony was so precise and comprehensive that defense attorneys struggled to find any aspect of the evidence to challenge. Agent Williams's investigation represents the gold standard for long-term undercover operations," testified FBI Director Jonathan Hayes, who had traveled to Chicago specifically to commend the operation's success. "Her dedication to duty while enduring systematic harassment demonstrates the highest traditions of federal law enforcement." The financial evidence was devastating to the defense. Bank records, offshore account information, and detailed operational procedures had all been documented with the kind of precision that made conviction virtually certain. The defendants had essentially provided a complete instruction manual for their criminal enterprise directly to a federal agent. Marcus Whitfield's attempt to claim entrapment failed spectacularly when prosecutors played recordings of him initiating discussions about money laundering operations, discriminatory employment practices, and methods for avoiding federal detection. The jury listened to 10 months of evidence that demonstrated clear criminal intent and systematic illegal activity. The defendants weren't tricked into committing crimes, Prosecutor James Mitchell explained during closing arguments. They were already committing crimes and chose to confess them in detail to someone they assumed was powerless to stop them. Bradley Chen's financial expertise became evidence against him when prosecutors demonstrated that his sophisticated understanding of money laundering techniques proved criminal intent rather than innocent mistake. His own spreadsheets and operational notes became exhibits that documented every aspect of the illegal enterprise. Thomas Morrison's offshore banking knowledge sealed his fate, when federal investigators traced the money laundering network to accounts in 7 countries, all of which Morrison had discussed in detail during recorded conversations at the Sterling Cafe. The sentencing phase attracted even more attention than the trial itself. Marcus Whitfield received a life sentence under RICO statutes, with the judge specifically noting that his systematic harassment of Agent Williams while she performed her federal duties demonstrated a complete lack of respect for law enforcement and the justice system. Bradley Chen and Thomas Morrison each received 30-year sentences, with no possibility of parole for the first 20 years. The judge emphasized that their willing participation in both financial crimes and discriminatory harassment made them dangers to society who deserved significant punishment. This case demonstrates that federal law enforcement has both the patience and the expertise to dismantle sophisticated criminal enterprises, Judge Patricia Williams observed during sentencing. Agent Williams' sacrifice and professionalism have protected society from criminals who believed themselves untouchable. The financial penalties were equally devastating. All assets connected to the money laundering operation were seized, including luxury cars, real estate, and offshore accounts worth over $75 million. The money was designated for restitution to victims of financial crimes and to fund future law enforcement operations. But the impact of Operation Sterling Silver extended far beyond individual prosecutions to fundamental changes in how federal law enforcement approaches financial crime investigation. The success of Operation Sterling Silver transformed federal law enforcement protocols for investigating financial crimes in ways that extended far beyond the Chicago field office. Agent Zara Williams's 10-month undercover operation became the template for a new approach to long-term criminal investigation that prioritized patience, precision, and complete evidence gathering over rapid arrests. The Williams Protocol, as it became known within the FBI, established new standards for undercover operations targeting organized financial crime. The protocol emphasized the importance of allowing criminals to document their own illegal activities, while federal agents gathered comprehensive evidence that would ensure successful RICO prosecutions. The Department of Justice created a new financial crimes task force specifically designed to replicate the success of Operation Sterling Silver. Agent Williams was promoted to senior supervisory agent and placed in charge of training other federal agents in long-term undercover techniques. Agent Williams has revolutionized how we approach white-collar crime investigation, explained FBI Assistant Director Robert Chen during a congressional hearing on federal law enforcement effectiveness. Her methods have proven that patient, methodical evidence gathering can achieve results that traditional investigation techniques cannot match. The Sterling Cafe itself underwent a complete transformation. Under new ownership and management, it became a legitimate restaurant that donated a portion of its profits to organizations supporting federal law enforcement and civil rights. A plaque near the entrance commemorated the dedication of federal agents who sacrificed personal safety to protect society from organized crime. The restaurant industry implemented new protocols for identifying and reporting suspicious financial activities, partly in response to the revelations about how money laundering operations had used upscale establishments as fronts for criminal enterprises. Congressional legislation strengthened penalties for harassment of undercover federal agents, with specific provisions addressing the kind of systematic discrimination that Agent Williams had endured during her investigation. The legislation was named the Williams Act in recognition of her sacrifice and professionalism. Law enforcement agencies across the country began implementing training programs based on Operation Sterling Silver's methods. The emphasis on long-term evidence gathering, complete documentation of criminal activities, and psychological resilience for undercover agents became standard curriculum at federal law enforcement academies. Agent Williams's investigation proved that criminals will confess to anything if they believe they're speaking to someone powerless, observed Dr. Sarah Martinez, a criminologist who studied the case for the Justice Department. Her success has changed how we understand the psychology of white-collar criminals. The international implications were equally significant. Foreign law enforcement agencies requested training in the Williams Protocol, and Agent Williams traveled to 17 countries to share her expertise with investigators targeting international money laundering operations. The academic community embraced Operation Sterling Silver as a case study in effective law enforcement. Business schools, law schools, and criminal justice programs integrated the case into their curricula, using it to demonstrate both the sophistication of modern financial crime and the effectiveness of patient federal investigation. This case proves that federal law enforcement can adapt to meet any challenge, testified Attorney General Patricia Thompson during a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing. Agent Williams's success represents the evolution of federal investigation techniques to match the sophistication of modern criminal enterprises. The Sterling Silver investigation generated 17 additional federal cases as criminals connected to Whitfield's network were identified and prosecuted. The evidence gathered during the 10-month operation provided leads that kept federal investigators busy for 3 years, dismantling criminal networks across multiple states. Financial institutions implemented new reporting protocols designed to identify the kind of money laundering patterns that Agent Williams had documented. The banking industry credited Operation Sterling Silver with preventing an estimated $200 million in additional money laundering activities. But perhaps the most important legacy of Operation Sterling Silver was the message it sent to criminals everywhere. Federal justice is patient, thorough, and absolutely unavoidable. 3 years after the arrests at the Sterling Cafe, Agent Zara Williams stood before a gathering of newly graduated FBI agents at the Quantico training facility, her hands, still bearing the scars from her previous undercover assignment, gesturing as she explained the principles that had made Operation Sterling Silver the most successful, long-term financial crimes investigation in Bureau history. Patience isn't just a virtue in federal law enforcement, she told the assembled agents. It's a weapon. Criminals destroy themselves when they believe they're safe from accountability, and our job is to give them the rope they need to hang themselves. Marcus Whitfield was serving his life sentence at ADX Florence, the federal supermax prison in Colorado. His criminal empire had been completely dismantled, with assets worth over $100 million seized and redistributed to victims of financial crimes. His name had become synonymous with the kind of white-collar arrogance that federal law enforcement was specifically designed to destroy. Bradley Chen and Thomas Morrison were both serving their 30-year sentences at different federal facilities, their financial expertise now useless and their former lives completely erased by the consequences of their criminal choices. Neither had been granted parole consideration, and federal prosecutors had indicated that additional charges were still possible based on evidence continuing to emerge from the Sterling Silver investigation. The Sterling Cafe had become an unlikely tourist destination, with law enforcement officers from around the world visiting the site where one of the most significant financial crimes investigations in federal history had been conducted. The restaurant's new owners had embraced this status, displaying photographs of Agent Williams and information about Operation Sterling Silver. Agent Williams has become a legend within federal law enforcement, explained FBI Director Sarah Chen during a ceremony commemorating the 5th anniversary of the Sterling Silver arrests. Her investigation represents everything that makes federal agents effective: intelligence, patience, courage, and an absolute commitment to justice. The Williams Protocol had been implemented by law enforcement agencies in 43 countries, leading to the successful prosecution of organized crime networks that had previously seemed untouchable. Agent Williams had become an international consultant on long-term undercover operations, sharing her expertise with investigators targeting everything from human trafficking to international terrorism. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of the Sterling Silver legacy was its impact on civil rights enforcement. The systematic discrimination that Agent Williams had endured and documented became the foundation for new federal protocols protecting workers from harassment based on race, disability, or economic status. What Marcus Whitfield and his associates thought was entertainment became evidence of federal civil rights violations, observed Dr. Patricia Martinez, who had written the definitive academic study of Operation Sterling Silver. Agent Williams transformed personal attacks into legal victories that protected thousands of other workers. The financial impact continued to grow as federal investigators used evidence from the Sterling Silver case to identify and prosecute additional criminal networks. The total amount of money recovered from related investigations exceeded $300 million, making it one of the most financially successful law enforcement operations in federal history. Agent Williams herself had been promoted to Assistant Director of the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, overseeing operations that had successfully dismantled criminal enterprises in 48 states and 17 foreign countries. Her methods had become the gold standard for federal financial crime investigation. The most important lesson of Operation Sterling Silver, Agent Williams concluded her address to the new federal agents, is that justice doesn't depend on immediate satisfaction. Justice depends on absolute thoroughness, complete professionalism, and the patience to let criminals destroy themselves with their own arrogance. As the ceremony concluded and the new agents prepared for their first assignments, Agent Williams looked down at the scars on her hands, no longer symbols of victimization, but reminders of the price she had been willing to pay to ensure that federal justice reached even the most arrogant criminals who believed themselves untouchable. If this story of federal justice inspired you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible tales of courage and accountability. Your support helps us bring these powerful stories of truth and justice